right in here. So this is a brief agenda. I'm not going to walk through the agenda in entirety, so we're going to go through the slides in the presentation. But basically, we're going to talk about point of sale compromises, point of sale weaknesses, and things in the payment networks. So real brief about Spider Labs, for those of you who don't know who we are. We're the advanced security team as part of TrustWave. For those of you who don't know who TrustWave is, there's actually members of TrustWave do Brazil here at the meeting as well. We have a Sao Paulo office. Our headquarters is in Chicago. We have offices all over the world, primarily information security and compliance work. We have an MSS offering. We do penetration testing, ethical hacking. In my team specifically within Spider Labs does incident response and forensic investigations, card compromise investigations, penetration testing, ethical hacking, wireless type work, and then also point of sale audits of point of sale systems. And that's where some of the data from this presentation comes from, is a combination of our point of sale assessments and our compromise investigations. So what we want to do to start out is really talk about a payment processing primer here. For those who aren't familiar with really the payment processing process, it's really involved with two different things from a merchant perspective. There's authorization and settlement. So the first slide here really talks about authorization. And so if you look at sort of the step-by-step 1 through 8 that we have on the slide, really step 1 is the card holder. So the card holder goes to, say, this bar and brings their credit card and makes a transaction. They buy a beer, they hand their credit card to somebody. The server will then take their card, swipe it into a point of sale system, and that's represented by the merchant there. The data is then taken in the system and then sent along various means. It could be dial-up, it could be internet, it could be many other ways. But primarily it's then sent over to the acquirer. The acquirer then takes the data and it passes it along to the card network. That may be Visa, MasterCard, American Express, with all the various card networks. Passes that data along to them, and then it goes to the issuer, because the issuer is who actually issued that card to the merchant or to the card holder. And so the issuer has to say, can I buy a beer? Do I have enough credit on my card to buy that beer today? The issuer then comes back and says yes, sends that information back to the card network. It then flows over to the acquirer, who then sends it back to the merchant. So that's really the circle, the life cycle that the transaction takes in going from a swipe back to the screen that says authorized. It allows that person, the server, to give me the beer and let me drink it at the bar. So that's really the process there. And then the other process that we wanted to talk about is settlement. Now this is where all the authorizations have been completed. Now you as a card holder, you go to an electronics store and you give your card to somebody and you want to buy a TV set. They authorize your card for $500. Now right then and there, the money is not taken out of your account. Your account is authorized for that amount, but it's not debited yet. It's not taken out of your credit that you're actually able to purchase that. Now at the end of the day, or whenever that merchant does settlement, some merchants do real-time settlement, some merchants do it at the end of the day. That merchant will batch up all their transactions and send them over to their acquirer and tell their acquirer, I had all these purchases today, I'd like to collect the money. Those transactions are then sent up to the card network from the acquirer, who then sends it over to the issuer, and then the communication goes back to the acquirer and back to the merchant. From a money standpoint, the money gets put into the merchant's account because they actually sold those goods. And then, of course, the card holder, people in this room, when you're making your purchase, now that money gets taken out of your account. So that's the process flow that takes place from authorization and settlement. So the other piece we want to talk about is the point of sale architecture. So what we have here is a standard merchant environment that we see when we're doing our investigations of card compromises, when we're doing an audit of a merchant environment. This is very standard. So here, I'll just point some of these things out for you. So here we have the front of the house. These are depicted by these point of sale terminals. And if you're just thinking of this bar, that would be the register that's behind the bar here, and that would be the register that's downstairs behind those bars or in a restaurant area. So that's where the servers interact with the restaurant manager. The next piece you have is called the back of the house system. And this is typically the back house server that's sitting within the manager's office, in a locked closet someplace. It's where all those front of the house systems send their data when they're looking for authorizations and settlement. The next piece we have is a modem hanging off the back of the house server. That's very, very typical in many point of sale implementations. It's there for remote support, for some, in some cases for authorization, if they're not using internet for authorization. Then you have a firewall switch, router, that type of device. That would be used if they are actually using it for internet authorizations, or even maybe for internet access at the restaurant, or whatever they're using it for. And then you have the IT integrator. So that person there, smiley face, that's a person that's supporting that infrastructure. So when the merchant calls and they say, I have a problem with my system, I can't run transactions, I have my system blue screen, I don't know what to do, they actually will go in and actually go into the system, or tell the merchant to reboot it, and they'll try to get into the system and try to fix it for them. And then of course you have the internet. Not really much to talk about there. Everybody knows what the internet is. And then you have your acquirer processor. That's the same organization we talked about on the previous slides in the process of authorization and settlement. That's the organization that the merchant actually sends their transactions to. That's who they have their agreement with. That's who they actually process with whenever they're running their transactions. They need to have that connection to that processor or that acquirer, or they can't take credit cards. So now we're going to talk about some of the common weaknesses that are here. So you're going to notice a lot of these common weaknesses in maybe Security 101 for many of you. What we see in the merchant worlds and in a lot of the service provider worlds, Security 101 isn't something they actually know. So it's sometimes very, very basic, but just to give you an understanding of what flaws actually exist today. And these are things that aren't, these are not things that would be chance to be able to find these problems in merchant environments. You can go into almost every single merchant environment and find something like this that exists. So we're talking about the point of sale system first. So A here, that's typically PC based. Most likely it's going to be running Windows. We do see some Linux implementations, and we see some older point of sale systems that are running things like Sh0t Unix or something along those lines. But primarily today we're talking about Windows. They have auto logon capabilities, so there isn't anybody who's actually authenticating to the system. So you reboot that system, it auto logins, and then it actually goes into a kiosk mode of that application. So if you were to go to say a grocery store and you go to the checkout line and you see the point of sale system, you see the screen, you see the keyboard, you see where they swipe, it looks like it's a point of sale system. It doesn't look like Windows, but chances are it's running like Windows XP or something behind the scenes. The application is just in the forefront there. Next piece here, we have RS-232 or USB card reader that's connected, and that's sort of depicted here from what you can see. That piece there, you're talking about a card reader that's either a serial connection or a USB connection into the point of sale system. And why is that a problem? We'll talk about that in further slides. They're not running any antivirus on these systems, so if there is a virus or something gets onto that network, this is supposed to be a closed network. You shouldn't have really people surfing and doing other things within this network, but it happens. And if a virus is to get in here, no one's going to detect it, and it's going to sort of run itself rampant within this environment. Default passwords are blank passwords. You often find systems with administrator passwords that are completely blank. Anybody can walk up to them, log in, type in administrators, log in, hit enter, and you're on the system with administrator privileges. And then the data that's sent from the front of the house systems, so not talking about the swipe, but as they're being authorized, the data that's being sent to the back of the house system is primarily, and almost I'd say 99% of the time, sent in the clear. And so we're talking about the track data that's on your cards, or the keyed in information that's being sent into the clear across the network. So now we'll talk a little bit about the common weaknesses of the back of the house system. So again, this is typically PC based. It's often, it shouldn't be, but it's often used as the office computer. When we go into an environment that's been compromised, we'll go in, and a typical example is we walk into an establishment like this bar, and we say we need to we're doing an investigation. There was a compromise. Can we look at the back of the house system? And 9 times out of 10, it's in the sort of the office that's back there. And when we walk up to it, and we move the mouse. There's things like internet poker or some other chat room or some other thing that's running on that system. It's not just being used as the back of the house credit card processing system. We often find video games on there. We find all sorts of things running on that system. Again, they usually have passwords, but their passwords are usually simple. It's often the name of the bar or the restaurant or the hotel is the password to get into the system. No auto update. So these systems are generally really, really out of date. To give you sort of the worst case example, there was a flower shop that we were doing an investigation. There was a chain of flower shops that were compromised. hundreds of thousands of credit cards were assumed compromised from these locations. And this system actually was 14 years old. It had not been patched or updated in 14 years. And so it was sitting directly on the internet. In that case, there was no firewall in place, and these systems were extremely, extremely old. And so when you're even talking about the newer systems, they typically don't install auto-update. And even when we're talking about no antivirus, oftentimes what we find is that the integrator who installed the system installs the trial version of McAfee antivirus or Norton antivirus, and it expires in 30 days or 90 days, and no one ever updates it. And so it's been running with 3-year-old antivirus definitions, protecting the system, not really protecting it. And then the auto-update feature as well. The systems haven't been patched in years, and they're usually turned on. Specifically, the integrators usually tell the merchants, do not run auto-update. Do not turn that on, because the integrators don't want to be responsible if the auto-update runs on a weekend or at 2 in the morning and it reboots the system and the POS system doesn't come back up. And so they don't want to get the phone call, so they tell them not to install any patches. So common weakness there, modem. This is usually used for remote support in case they have to come in the middle of the night or during a busy time to fix the system. Auto answer is always on these modems. So anybody who's war dialing is going to find this modem listening. The security policy would say only turn it on when it's needed, but we don't see that happening. The merchants actually just leave it running with modems plugged in, listening, always answering anybody who wants to call in. Then you have your switch, firewall, router, or whatever what may be protecting the environment. If it does exist, if it's there, we will find typically it's consumer grade firewall, something you buy at an electronics store, put in place. Default configuration is almost always kept, so it's something that's not actually changed. The passwords are always the same. Whatever the default configuration is kept on the system. Allows remote access on inbound ports, and so often we see things like PC Anywhere, VNC, other remote access tools running on the back of the house system, and they just map or they map that IP address to the outside and allow someone to come in and remotely gain access to the system for support purposes. And it's typically if they're not using a modem, if they're using your internet for support. They're also doing things like allowing all outbound access. And so anything from that environment is allowed outbound, even though there may be only one specific protocol, one specific IP address that they need to be talking to, like the acquirer. They allow everything outbound, so that you can sort of think if an attacker was to get onto those systems, it's sort of a free reign for them to do really whatever they want outbound. And then oftentimes there's integrated wireless. If you go to an electronics store and you buy the integrated wireless router, firewall, that whole package, and you set it up, it's oftentimes they're not even using the wireless access point in the environment, but it's plugged in and enabled, and it's running. And then no one's watching the logs, of course. So if someone's in that environment and doing things, no one really knows that someone's there, and no one's watching those logs. So next person here is the weakness. We have integrator IT support. No security experience at all. We often talk to these organizations, and really all they know how to do is set up the point of sale system and leave. And then they know how to reboot it and maybe apply a patch to the point of sale system if it needs it. They do not have any security experience, and so you can sort of think about that as just an IT person coming in and set up a merchant's environment from a small establishment all the way to establishments that have hundreds of locations. The people setting up the systems have no security experience at all and really have no security knowledge. They're really trying to just get the job done. That's basically what they're trying to do. And then the shared password files. We see this all the time. They have password files to get into 20, 30 locations. That's what they support in their city. And they have all the passwords in an Excel spreadsheet sitting on their computer or sitting on a USB key fob or something like that. And they also work from home. So they get a call at 2 in the morning to fix a system. They just connect in from their DSL line or cable modem line and connect in and do their work. And so now the security of that person's home computer is now sort of bleeding into the security of the merchant environments. Internet, not really much to say there. Clear text data can be intercepted if it's being sent. We often find that's not really the weakness. Most point-of-sale implementations are sending their data to their acquirers over things like SSL. The acquirer processor. There's all types of acquiring processors. Of course, in Brazil, there's one acquirer processor, but in sort of contrast in the U.S., there's hundreds, if not thousands, of different processors and acquirers. So your very large acquirers generally don't have major issues, but when you're talking about organizations that have 2 employees and they're considered a processor, you run into a lot of problems. Specifically, they're hosting multiple merchants' data sitting on their systems. We see things like processors and service providers that are being run out of barns, and just really stacks of computers stacked up with data lines coming in, and it's really problematic. Lack of security budget, really no security budget at all. They don't really pay attention to security when you're talking about those small processors. And then web-based merchant portals. We see it quite often where, in order for the merchants to actually come in and check their accounts and look up various things, there's a web-based portal. What we find is those web-based portals are just written by somebody on a weekend or sort of slapped together with a MySQL database on the back end, and no security is paid attention to it. So you can get access to transaction logs, merchant IDs, and actually process transactions and hijack merchant accounts through those portals. And then we still see FTP for online, for offline batch processing. There's been organizations where a common point of purchase or a common point of commonality and where the compromise took place was sort of pointing to one processor. And we found out they were using FTP. And when we just did an anonymous FTP login to the FTP site, we were able to browse all the different directories that were used by the merchants to upload the data and download anything we wanted. And it was all clear text, all the batch files, including all the track data and all the credit card information. So now let's we walk through some of the sort of primer there, talk about the various weaknesses in the credit card processing architectures. Really, what we want to do is talk about the account data compromises. So this is what we're talking about: a cyber criminal, an attacker that's coming into an environment that's trying to gain access to a system that's storing, processing, or transmitting cardholder data. And really, today, what they're targeting, targeting those systems to store, process cardholder data because they know they can get access to that data very, very easily. So what we want to do is sort of show you here. I'm not going to walk through this in detail, but essentially this is what track data looks like. And so if you were to take your credit card out of your pocket and look at the magnetic stripe data that's on there, this is what it's made up of. And it's not encrypted. It's not encrypted on the back of your card. If you were to go and get a USB card reader, go online and buy one, plug it into the USB port on your computer, fire up Notepad, and swipe your card, you're going to see all the track data printed, clear text across your screen. And that's how the data is actually sent to the point of sale systems at the swipe. So there's various other fields, your track 1, track 2, track 3, various makeups of them, but essentially the basic things that you have is the primary account number, that's your credit card number, you have your name, and then you have your expiration date and various other information that's stored on the card. And that's what when I'm talking in further slides, that's called track data. And one thing to note from a PCI standpoint, that data is what's prohibited of being stored. So as a merchant or a service provider, you're not allowed to store that data post-authorization. It's prohibited from being stored because when someone gains access to it, they can do a lot of damage. Other sort of piece of data that is considered sort of in scope of PCI is the card validation code. So that's either a 3-digit code or the 4-digit code on your credit card. So that's the piece that validates that you actually are physically holding your card in your hand when you make a card not present transaction. And so sort of contrast the track data transactions, or the terminology is used as card present transactions because you're actually standing there and you hand it to the server or you swipe it yourself. Card not present is when you're on the phone talking to somebody or you're going on a website making a purchase. So that's considered card not present. So the only way to authenticate the person that they're actually physically holding the card is to use something that's not stored within the track data, and that's specifically the security code that's there. So let's work backwards through that flow that I showed on the previous slide. So you have your cyber criminals, your tools, your gaps, your rewards. Let's sort of work backwards through that process. So what's the reward? The cyber criminals that go in and compromise a merchant system. There's a lot. There's a huge market for buying and selling credit card data. So it's either raw data that's just in text files, or it's worked its way up to actually physical counterfeit credit cards. It's actually rather trivial for people to go through that process. We see a lot of cases where people are actually printing writing the track data in things like hotel keys. And so then they'll go to places where it's unattended, where they actually can swipe their card and are actually swiping that data using hotel keys and various other mag stripe utilities. You also can take your own physical card. So we hear about this quite often, where someone takes their card, their own personal card, and they delete the track data off the back of their card and rewrite somebody else's data. And so they can go into even a grocery store and hand the card to somebody, and chances are they're not going to check the name or the other information that's on the front of that card. So it's just some sort of examples of where things are being bought and sold, and they use e-gold and other currencies to actually buy and sell those cards. So what gaps are being exploited? What are the gaps that we're finding? So majority of the cases, and so this is taken from our sort of global statistics of our investigations, it's roughly around 450 different investigations we performed. Majority of the cases are card present versus card not present, and that's for some people it seems a little odd. You think the cyber criminals are targeting websites and various other places like that. It's actually not the case, because the more valuable information is the track data, and so they're going after those environments. And so specifically, the card present is 69% of the cases that we performed. Some other sort of comments here is that 95% of those card present compromises involved track data storage. And so if you think of sort of the vast majority of the merchants that are out there, all the card present environments, all the stores, all the restaurants, all the bars, all the hotels, all those environments, and there's many more of those types of environments than there are websites out there that take credit cards. And so that's a huge pool of target for these cyber criminals. And if 95% of the time they're actually going to get what they're looking for, the track data, it's sort of a green field for them to start hacking and breaking into these systems. And then also what we found is sort of the adoption of broadband internet. It's really increasing the pool of targets. Like I mentioned, sort of the cases where they're 14-year-old and 10-year-old systems, we often find when we're talking to the merchants that, we say, well, when did you get internet access in your restaurant? And they say, well, 2 months ago. And so when we sort of back up and say, well, how did you get internet access? They go, well, we saw that there was an advertisement, $20 per month for high-speed internet access. Someone came out and they plugged it into our system for us and set us up, and now we're on the internet. We sort of map that out, and you find out that someone actually plugged the physical DSL connection into the back of the house server, the server that actually is storing all that data and processing all that data. So there's no security involved. The 10-year-old system has been patched in 10 years. So plugging it right into the internet is sort of a recipe for disaster, and that's happening every single day. Then you sort of break this down by industries. So we're sort of seeing food service and retail are the biggest areas that people are breaking into today. So you can see restaurants, either it's quick service or other types of restaurants, a really big target. And it's not as if they're targeting those organizations directly. You run an MF scan of a large network block, and you find things like PC Anywhere listening or VNC listening, and then you start digging a little bit deeper. And on the other side, lo and behold, it's a back of the house server with thousands of credit card transactions sitting in a text file or in a log file. But those are the organizations that are getting hit the most. Food service is getting hit in sort of its rapid pace, mainly because what we found is they're getting internet access in those restaurants because they want to attract customers. And so they want to be able to put those Wi-Fi signs in your window and advertise that they have Wi-Fi access. So when you come in there and eat a sandwich, you can fire up your laptop and surf the internet at the same time. They didn't need to have internet access, but they're doing that for sort of a competitive advantage to all their other restaurants in their neighborhood, and now they're being compromised because of that. So then what types of systems are we seeing that are being hacked into? So number one is the software POS. That's the system that's running a PC-based operating system, runs many different vendors write software that runs on Windows and other operating systems. And so it's simple to use, easy for them to support, and that's really the number one place that we're seeing people targeted. Shopping carts, when we're talking about e-commerce, we see the compromises there. Mostly are involved around SQL injection attacks. There's a lot of shopping carts that are sort of poorly written, and even when downloaded and taken and installed, day one, they're susceptible to SQL injection attacks that allow people to just literally dump the entire customer database from the browser. The back-end systems, that's what we'll typically call your payment switches. And so we're not talking about the point-of-sale back-of-the-house servers that we showed in the architecture. In large organizations, if you're a merchant that has 1,000 environments, 1,000 restaurants, or 1,000 hotels, you're likely not going to be doing authorizations and settlement from the individual locations. In many cases, you're actually taking that data and bringing it all back to corporate and doing all the real-time authorizations from your own payment switches. And it's those systems that when they're targeted, the attackers get access to not only thousands of credit cards, but millions of credit card transactions. Because if you figure a restaurant or a busy restaurant that has restaurant chain that has 1,000 locations on a busy Friday night, 1,000 times a transaction every 5 minutes, that's a lot of transactions flowing through. And if you gain access to that system, you literally can watch these transactions just flow into your pocket. Hardware terminals, we don't see many cases with hardware terminals, but typically when we do, it's the actual tampering of the devices. And it's usually out-of-date head devices, pin entry devices that are being used that are being modified. So what they'll do is they'll crack them open. They will install another swipe head and sometimes a GSM module or a Bluetooth module into the point of sale system, into the point of sale terminal. And then when and they'll go in and they'll wear a shirt that says point of sale repair, and they'll go into the merchant environment and say, hey, I'm here to replace your point of sale system. And the store manager says, okay, here you go. And they swap out the point of sale system, and then they leave. And then next week they come back with a Bluetooth device, or that device dials up and it dials out to someplace and actually sends the data off. We see that quite often. When we do see it, that's usually the cases, but they're very, very small compared to the actual PC type point of sale compromises that we see. So what tools are being used? So are there specific tools that are being used to compromise these point of sale systems? Not really. There are really no specialized tools that are being used. These are your basic security flaws, unpatched Windows systems, Windows shares that are available to the internet, remote desktop that's running, Telnet SSH, all those various things that are listening on the internet. That combined with weak passwords and weak lockdown policies and no patching is how people are actually getting into the systems. So getting into the systems is actually rather easy. The other piece, so how are they getting in? Like I mentioned, the identical credentials, that's a huge, huge problem. We've seen a whole chain of compromises. It was literally one after another where the integrator was using the exact same username and password down the line. And so the attackers were scanning that area, literally that area of the internet, and finding all these same point of sale systems in the same town that are using the same DSL provider, and literally just logging in one by one and gaining access to the systems. Default passwords are very, very common, and then brute forceable Windows terminal services, brute forceable passwords are common as well. When in cases like VNC, we often see outdated VNC servers that are running that have authentication bypass vulnerabilities. The other piece here, we really want to talk about what tools are being. We'll talk about the tools. The big piece is here to talk about. So, when it's prohibited data storage, it's being stored on the system. Files are simply downloaded or uploaded off the system. So these are files that are sitting on the hard drive waiting for someone to grab. When it's a little bit more complex, we're seeing network sniffers. So they get onto the system and they're installing sniffers on the back of the house server. And like I mentioned in the architecture, at the front of the house systems are sending the data and clear out over the network. They're able to sniff the network out sniff the data right off the wire. It's rather easy. These new emerging trends that we're seeing, keystroke loggers, even though it's sort of an old technology, are actually being used quite often now. When you're talking about the point of sale device that's connected to the point of sale PC, it's connected over RS-232 or USB. So what they do is they install keystroke loggers on those systems to intercept the data on the system itself. So as someone's swiping, data is being sent across that channel, and actually it just intercepts it before it actually hits the point of sale software. And then the new pieces we're seeing are the custom malware, custom point of sale malware that we're seeing that are actually being written to target specific point of sale systems. There's a few popular systems out there that the attackers are figuring out, and they're actually writing malware that once infected identifies where these files are being stored and where the temporary files are, and pulling that data in real time and then setting them off the system. And one of the newest trends we're seeing is the parsing of volatile memory. So essentially what they're doing is they're actually loading memory dumpers onto the system and watching the processes, the point of sale processes. And as the cards are being swiped, they're pulling the data out of memory and writing it to disk. And so even if it's being encrypted by the point of sale software when it's being written to disk, it still has to be in memory at some point in the clear, from when it's being swiped to when it's being authorized. At some point, it's in the clear in the memory, and they're actually just pulling it right out of memory and writing it to disk. So, where are these sources coming from? It's really hard to tell. We get a lot of different IP addresses from all over the world, but we're seeing a lot from China, Vietnam, Eastern Europe. That's where primarily they're coming from, but of course that's difficult to tell. It could be somebody in Chicago that's doing it, but just using servers that are located in China or Vietnam to run the attacks. But that's where the source IP addresses are from. As far as the speed of fraudulent accounts making their way to market, we see compromises that take place on a Friday, and by Monday morning, there's $500,000 worth of fraud done on those accounts. And so, and they're card-present transactions. And so they're actually pulling the data off the systems, creating counterfeit cards, and selling them on the street within a couple of days, and actually running, and people are producing fraud on those cards. So we'll go through a really, really quick case study. We have about 5 minutes left. Basically, this was a 14-location grocery store. They were identified as a common point of purchase by Visa. What essentially that means is Visa correlates all their fraud reports and correlated all those cardholders that were all complaining they had fraud on their cards, and found out the one place they had in common was this grocery store chain. So they initiated an investigation. We went out and looked at these locations. We found out they were accepting debit and credit transactions using software POS and PIN-pad devices, so your PED devices. They used a single integrator for all the locations, and they had T1 and DSL at all the locations. But there was no direct connectivity between the retail locations, so there wasn't where someone got into one location and hopped to the other locations. It really wasn't that type of architecture. They all had various providers of T1, various providers of DSL, and various other things. So what did we find on there? So one, we found the attacker entered the system's remote access application and used a third party, that was used for third-party integrator support. In this case, it was VNC. They installed a packet sniffer on the back of the house server and was able to intercept all the traffic. So, when they did that, they identified that traffic was being encrypted. So this is one of the point-of-sale systems out there that have a little bit higher level of security. They actually encrypt the traffic on their local network. It's actually very rare, but it was the case in this environment. Then they subsequently jumped to the point-of-sale registers and installed serial port sniffers to capture the account data that was traversing the point-of-sale devices over to the registers, and they found out they had success. So they went and actually uploaded that data from the remote access application, just sort of downloaded and applicate that data, and they were on these systems for over 3 months before anybody figured it out. When we went into the environment, there was a lot of these systems. We actually saw them on the system. They're actually connected. So one question we had is how are all the 14 disconnected and geographically dispersed locations compromised within 1 hour? We had signatures of people getting on these systems one after another. We found out that on one of the systems, just one, on one of the systems that were compromised, there was a file, and it actually contained the credentials and the locations, the IP addresses of all 14 locations on it. This was an Excel spreadsheet that was left on the system by the integrator. And the other sort of bad part, the bad news there, is that they also supported over 350 other merchants, and all the username, passwords, and IP addresses were in that file as well. So what happened? It grew to over 50 stores were involved in the compromise, millions of dollars in loss, and third-party integrator was being held liable by the merchants. And so there's a lawsuit that's going on right now to sue that integrator for all the losses, because many of these smaller merchants actually went out of business because of this. Because of the fines and having to repay for all the fraud. And then also the United States Secret Service got involved because it was a large enough case. So I guess in summary, the skill set required to compromise point-of-sale systems is actually rather minimal. Anybody who's somewhat skilled in security and using some of those tools can actually compromise these systems. The food service, what we're seeing in the U.S. is really the largest piece, but even around the world, the retail environments are the largest environments that are being targeted. Remote access solutions is a huge problem for point-of-sale systems, especially when they're not being locked down. And then, really, most compromises we find can be avoided by following simple security practices. And so, simple things that everyone in here probably takes for granted are not being done by these businesses, and leaving their data exposed, and of course our data, because we're the cardholders that shop at these locations, leaving our data exposed to the attackers. So that's it. That's all I have.
No questions? I have a question, actually.
Sure.
The touchless in the US, you have now the credit or the ATM cards and credit cards. They have the touchless.
Yeah.
What's the name of
PayPass.
that? PayPass. Does it anything change, or that's only the point of sale?
Yeah.
So like in that architecture, the data is still processed through the system. And so the data itself, once it leaves that point of sale device, is exactly the same. There's no difference. It's more of a convenience than a real security implementation. It's more so someone can, I guess, just walk up and touch their hip to the thing. They don't have to take their wallet out of their pocket.
¿Alguien más? No?
Do you think that PCI is close to the real needs of the business, or just something to have? And what do you think about the new version of PCI?
Sure. So what I can say, merchant environments that we see in these investigations are remotely following PCI. They're not even following the basic levels of PCI. So PCI, if these merchants would apply some of those principles, they likely would not have been compromised. Things like basic passwords, not leaving your systems exposed without a firewall, basic things like that. And then the new standard, the new changes in PCI. One of the big things that we see, and I didn't really touch on that, as far as the wireless compromises, some of the very large, high-profile compromises that we've investigated and read about in a paper, were involved with web. They had web wireless, and so the big change of forcing people to really kill web in the retail environments is going to help, because at least that awareness for these merchants, at least so they pay attention that you probably shouldn't be having open wireless access points for your inventory, or even just using web for inventory. It causes a lot of problems.
What about the new version? It's more hands-on. What do you think about it?
Yeah, so I mean, it's similar. It's similar to the older versions. The one other piece that's big there is the requirement 6.6 that talks about the web application firewalls and the code review and the application penetration testing. I think is something that was a recommendation in the previous version, is now a requirement, which I think is going to help in the e-commerce world quite a bit, because many of the e-commerce merchants that we see don't pay attention to that at all. I mean, you could run vulnerability scans, again, you could run Nessus against your system, but it's not going to find some of the deep-rooted application security issues that are available.
¿Alguien más? ¿Ninguno? Louis? Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.